Okay, we've had a brief overview of the 8 stages of Patanjali. We've now looked at the promises you make before you start doing yoga, what you shouldn't do, the yamas, what you should do, the niyamas, and now, which take us all on this sort of spiritual path to this highest state of self-realization, as they call it. And now I'd just like to give a little bit of a history lecture here on how Tantra came into being. So, because if you want to understand modern day yoga, how it's come into existence, you need to understand Patanjali, and you also need to actually understand something about Tantra. And if you go to yoga schools like Satchidananda, then that's actually tantric yoga. They don't say it, but the teachings are largely tantric yoga. Most of the Hatha yoga schools come from Tantra. They come originally from Patanjali, and then what happened was there was these little dark people in India called Dravidians, who were there for probably tens of thousands of years, if not longer, who lived in India. And then about 3,500–4,000 years ago, these basically Persians from modern day Iran invaded India about 1,500 BC, and they brought in what is known as the Aryan religion into India, the Vedic religion. And they brought in all their Persian gods from the Middle East. They were fair-skinned, well, they were more lighter-skinned than the Dravidians, and they were bigger, and they were much more violent, and soon they took over northern India. But because the Dravidians had this beautiful, peaceful religion already developed of yoga, these violent white-skinned Aryans, or fair-skinned or pale-skinned Aryans, Persians basically, were transformed. They were won over by the peace and love of these Aboriginals, if you like, these native people of India, these Dravidians, and their violent polytheistic Aryan religion got transformed into this mix of the Persian religion and the yoga of the Dravidians. So this took place around about 1,500 BC, and that's when all the Vedic stories and mythology and stories of, for instance, Rama and Krishna, these were all these basically Persian invaders who then were converted. Their stories then became this kind of religious mythology that mixed in with the Dravidian religion and of the yoga and their system of meditation, which beautifully ended up entwining together to create the Hindu religion. And but it was largely kind of a mythical kind of storytelling. Things like the Mahabharata and the great battle on at Kurukshetra between the cousins with Arjuna fighting against Duryodhana, with Krishna as his charioteer, and then they tell this symbolic story of that battle and how they reincarnation occurs, and what duties a person has to do, and why you have to fight a war even when you don't want to, and on it goes through the Bhagavad Gita. But it's a great story, and it has a lot of moral teachings within it and so forth, and a lot of wisdom, but it doesn't really give you a system. And it was Patanjali who, time of Christ, ended up creating this very codified step-by-step system with physical things that you could do to bring yourself to that state of enlightenment. So, from the 10th to the 1st century, from about 1000 BC to the time of Christ, there was two forms of Hinduism at that stage. There was what was known as the Vedas, which were these stories, like I just mentioned, the Upanishads, Krishna, Ramayana, Mahabharata, these kind of all stories, which were all controlled by the priest caste. This whole caste system developed of 4 castes of various levels of superiority, from Brahma, Kshatriya, warrior, to the Vaishnava, the trader, to the Sudra, the sort of working man, to the untouchable. So they had this very rigid class system that you could not move between. Everything was kind of controlled by the priests through all these kind of rituals that you had to do, sacrifices to purify yourself. Everything was very stratified and controlled, and the ability to just come from wherever and attain that state of enlightened bliss, was sort of blocked for most people because they were stuck into this kind of social system. But there were these ascetics that went and often lived by themselves in the woods and did all these extreme practices to try and reach the state of enlightenment. But nothing was codified about how these ascetics lived. They were just considered these sort of religious people who gave up the material world and went and lived in the forest. And they were respected for that. But no path was clearly delineated of how you attain this enlightenment until Patanjali came along. There was, in Hinduism, there was also, they had their Vedic religion, which was all controlled by the caste and that sort of society. And then there was a non-Vedic system also in operation within that early Indian society. And we're talking about from 1000 BC to the time of Christ. And this non-Vedic, which wasn't within the religious texts that were all approved by the various conferences of the high priest caste, the Brahmin caste, is a sort of not really considered very proper or acceptable, but everything that that was that those priests rejected, as they didn't like, ended up getting sort of thrown out into this what was considered non-Vedic yoga, and that was where all that rejected material, religious material that they didn't like, ended up being grouped together and eventually started to be called Tantra. So Tantra is not Vedic. It doesn't come from, the 30,000 volumes of the Vedas. It's what was rejected from the Vedas. So, but there was a lot of other material that they didn't like, that was not discarded, and the people that continued to practice that were called the Tantrics. Tantra means essence, or to weave. So it's it's the real sort of essential substance behind everything. Now, about 500 BC, this very great being was born as a prince called Siddhartha, Gautama Siddhartha, and he ended up rejecting his parents' desire for him to become a king, and they tried to protect him from seeing anything that was harmful. So they just had him living in paradise in a palace, only seeing beautiful things. And eventually one day he walked out and saw poverty and suffering and old age and everything, and he was astounded by it all. And he was so overwhelmed, because he'd never seen it before, because his parents thought it was too harmful for such a divine being to look upon these things. And he felt all this pity at the suffering and this desire to actually help the people that he was meant to be ruling over, to actually go through the experience they were going through, and to help them out of it. So he rejected his divine life of luxury, and decided to go back to the most simple way of life, to find the true essence of life. So he joined these sadhus, these sort of original Dravidians who practiced this ascetics in the forest, and went through all these sufferings and fastings, and starved themselves and pierced themselves, and lived on rocks and so forth, slept on rocks or sharp nails or whatever, and to overcome their attachment to their body. And he went and tried to find the truth of who he truly was, what this existence was really about, and he felt he could find the answer through them. So he went to those people and lived with them for many, many years. But that kind of self-flagellation or torture that they were putting themselves through, he kind of got this kind of epiphany under a Bodhi tree, of this kind of middle way, where it wasn't necessary to go through all that suffering to attain, the highest state. And that was when he supposedly attained enlightenment, and where his name changed to the Buddha. So Buddhism, which developed from that, tossed away the caste system and all this rigidity that the Hindu system had got lost in through the Vedas, where nobody could move within society. And the kind of it was almost similar to the state the Jews were in with the Pharisees and Sadducees at the time of Jesus, where there was this total rigidity within Judaism where, you know, there was no love in the way that people operated. They just followed according to rules, and they had to, you know, if they ever committed sin, they had to pay for sacrifices, which the priests, you know, gained a lot of money out of. And it was a kind of a system that was stuck and was hypocritical and had lost love, feeling of love. And Buddha, 500 years before Christ, sort of was this kind of, almost a kind of revolutionary for Hinduism, because he just completely chucked away the caste system. And he said, and he even chucked away the kind of asceticism that the yogis were following, and he focused on just attaining inner truth through a very simple process of meditating through concentration on your breath and on your body, without needing to go to any extremes. And he used this system to attain a state of peace that liberated himself, liberated that being who followed that path from the source of all suffering, which was the body's senses and their desire for the senses to be fulfilled. So Buddhism's whole focus is that living in essence is suffering, and the path to attain enlightenment is to remove that suffering. And the way you remove it is through a process of meditation. So, and you don't have to be stuck in any caste or doing any prayer rituals or pujas, or, you know, paying priests for your sins, for removing your sins in order to, you know, get rid of your suffering. All you have to do is follow this process of meditation. And it does not matter what caste you are, it's irrelevant. What level of society, anyone who follows his path, whether they're, you know, the lowest sweeper on the ground or the richest person in the world, can equally attain it. So he threw out the caste system, and it was very popular in India, and it became the most biggest and most powerful religion in India, and by about 250, 350 BC, Ashoka, the biggest, greatest king of India at that time, was converted to Buddhism, and he, you know, began to change India towards the whole subcontinent, towards following a Buddhist way of living, and the Hinduism started to disintegrate, and the priests and the caste system started to lose all its power. Now, not only that, Buddhism also said there's no God. All these gods that you're worshipping, they're nonsense. Because under the Vedas, you know, they had thousands of gods that they worshipped. They said the God itself is just a concept, and it doesn't really exist. So this this state of this new religion that came in, called Buddhism, as they followed this form of meditation, they at that stage the Hindus were caught in what is known as dualism, which is that everything exists because there's an opposite. At the very base of everything is an opposite. So it's like the binary system in mathematics. The most basic system is the binary system in maths. So, and you can reduce that in a religious system to a system of opposites called duality. And the Hindus at that stage were arguing, is duality the highest form of spirituality? And there was another school of philosophy there who was arguing, no, there's something beyond that called non-dualism, where you go beyond the fact that there's opposites to this kind of oneness. And so that was, the highest state that Hinduism had reached, which is connected to what is known as Atma and Anatma, self and non-self. So this non-dualism was sort of the peak of Hinduism at that stage. But Buddhism came along and said, no, we go even beyond that. It's not just a state of non-duality where you reach a state of oneness, which you might call God. No, the full truth is emptiness, which is beyond non-duality. So beyond oneness. So Buddha preached this kind of philosophy where the oneness, where we were all unified, was actually not the highest state. There was a state beyond that which was beyond oneness, which was known as emptiness. And it's in that sort of void of emptiness, which is known as nirvana, that is the highest state, the state of complete formlessness, which is the state that the Buddhists believe is the state of complete enlightenment. So that's what the Buddhists were trying to attain, that's what they believed, and there was huge arguments between the Buddhists and the Hindus about whether, oneness was the highest state or emptiness was the highest state. Now, 500 years went by and Buddhism was still tops in India. Hinduism was going down the drain. People were thinking, yes, this getting rid of this caste system and all these sacrifices and the priests in control was a really good idea. And emptiness, no God, sounds a lot more like the truth than all these gods and this oneness, which, maybe there's something beyond the oneness. It seemed to make sense, so it was very, very successful. But Patanjali wasn't a Buddhist. He was a Hindu, and at that time the Hindus were, in a state of real worry that their religion was going to die out completely, and all that would be left was Buddhism. And so he wasn't convinced by Buddhism. He thought there was something, there was an essence, there was something within within Hinduism, within the yoga teachings, that was not met in the Buddhist teachings. So he did not convert to Buddhism, and he instead tried to reform Hinduism, and he reformed it through codifying a bit like Buddha had codified the steps, and there is an 8-path step within Buddhism through this process of overcoming suffering. So he sort of followed what Buddhism had done, but did it for Hinduism, and he codified into a step-by-step path how you could attain enlightenment if you followed Hindu yoga. Now, at that stage, Patanjali was sticking to the Hindu form of yoga, and he also stuck to a particular older philosophical school of yoga, which was the dualist school. And as far as he was concerned, the principal purpose of the yoga was to transcend the material world, to transcend matter, to transcend the body. And the whole steps that he codified were how you transcend the senses, if you like, of your body, to master the body, to reach that state of meditation where you have detached from the body, and in that sense you reach a state of non-separation. So you are detached from your body, and you are surrendered to the external world to an extent that there's no separation between your body and the external world. They're one and the same. So, his the state of bliss, of samadhi, of enlightenment to Patanjali was, to many of the great philosophers and theologians at that time, was limited, because Patanjali's main focus was just overcoming the physical body, the material world, and entering the world, the spiritual world, and overcoming the senses that connect the internal body to the external world. And to them, this was just the body-spirit duality, the material versus the spiritual. So most of the yogis at that time just thought of Patanjali as a dualist. So they didn't consider him a super great philosopher. They felt that they'd reached beyond dualism, and they were already in non-dualism, where they were at the state of oneness. And the Buddhists thought they were even beyond that, where they'd reached a state beyond non-dualism, where they were in a state of emptiness. So Patanjali wasn't universally accepted by all the Hindus. He was, just considered one particular spiritual path, one particular philosophical kind of path that you could follow. It wasn't something that was embraced by all of the Hindus. Certainly not embraced by the Buddhists. Now, how was it that Patanjali became so important in modern Western yoga? The basis of modern Western yoga. And the reason it is because his little codified system was how you take the practical steps through doing the postures, doing the breath work, taking the vows, developing the control over the senses and the concentration, step by step, to reach that state of meditation, of ultimately, I suppose, a kind of discarding of the body, discarding of the material world, so you're completely in the spiritual world, which to him was the samadhi. Now, after Patanjali left his body, disappeared from this world, Patanjali wasn't, as I said, he wasn't really embraced by the Hindus. He wasn't considered anything particularly special back then. In fact, the Vedic yoga, the Buddhists didn't even, as far as they were concerned, he wasn't even a Buddhist, so it was irrelevant. And they were the majority religion at that time. The Vedic priests, which was the bulk of the Hindus, were clinging on to their religion and their power back then. And they were losing their majority, and they certainly were not particularly interested in Patanjali. They were more interested in people following their rituals. Patanjali wasn't about that. He was about giving a path like Buddha gave to attain enlightenment. So he didn't get much interest from the Vedic priests. And even the non-Vedic, the people that weren't particularly interested in being controlled by the caste system or the priests, but still were Hindus and didn't want to accept Buddhism. And those people had developed their own system, and that ended up being kind of gelled together under this name Tantra. They didn't accept Patanjali's teaching either. So certainly not, his end goal, which they considered inferior, was just a dualist goal. So that, from after Patanjali died to about 500 AD, about the time the Roman Empire collapsed in the West, Patanjali really, was almost unheard of in India. Not that relevant. When around about the 500 AD in India, the Tantra Buddhism started to go into a decline. The Vedic religion started to regain control over the population. Buddhism just sort of was considered too kind of boring, too kind of not exciting enough, had no gods, no stories, was just very dry, and just had this goal of a kind of void. So it sort of lost the simple people, and the sort of flamboyance of Hinduism began to, with all its stories, etc., began to take hold again. And another thing happened around about that time. Certainly in India, their sexual freedom was pretty much, there were no taboos. It was sex was considered a perfectly natural part of life and something to be worshipped, and it was represented in all the religious temples, where they showed naked people all the time, and often dancing and playing and celebrating and so forth. And that the Buddhists were, not rejected that and thought it was unclean, and the people didn't it was too stultifying, Buddhism. So the people thought, no, Hinduism is offering this much more sexually liberated way of life. We prefer that, and it offers us much more, sensual enjoyment. So, so Buddhism started to die in India, and from the 6th to 12th century, from about 500 AD to about 1100 AD, Hinduism started to re-flourish and started to take over, and Buddhism almost died out totally, under the strong influence of Tantra, because Tantra had this acceptance of the physical world and of the senses. It wasn't a rejection of the senses. It wasn't to, you know, go and beat yourself up, doing asceticism, starving yourself to death and so what. It was to enjoy the senses and to feel the most you could from them. And these weren't particularly Vedic teachings. They'd been rejected by the Vedic teachings because the priests were a bit puritanical and trying to control people. They didn't want mixing between castes and stuff like that. The Tantra kind of threw out a lot of that old religious stuff and adopted this kind of acceptance and enjoyment of the senses. And that was when the renaissance of Indian sexual liberation really occurred between the 6th and 12th centuries. And at that stage in the temples, they would be producing statues of orgies and all sorts of, you know, all sorts of erotic acts, some pretty depraved we might consider. There's a few of them on the screen there. That's a picture from Kajra Road that I took myself. But this was, you know, not, you know, some seedy brothel that these statues were written in. This was in their main religious temple, like, you know, your Anglican church. That's what they were doing. That's what they were showing on their drawing on the statues, and that sort of sex was occurring, you know, in the temples themselves, in people's houses, etc. This was a time of really very unrepressed sexual freedom, and combining all this, using these sexual acts to, in a spiritual, religious way, to help people attain enlightenment, attain freedom and peace within themselves. So there was no shame, guilt about sex, and it was being used for the highest purpose to attain enlightenment. So it was a very advanced civilization at that stage, which was largely under the influence of the tantric teachings, the non-Vedic teachings. And this was this form of Hinduism at that stage was known as union with the good god Mukti. They were non-dualists. They thought that matter and spirit were one and the same. So they weren't trying to reject the material world as the dualists were and then just only live in a spiritual world, which is basically what the Christians believe. They accepted totally the material world as being the spiritual world, and that one should just embrace it. And that was how they didn't reject the senses, they embraced the senses. So this was a focus on the enjoyment of the earthly life on the basis that we are one and the same with it. The earth is us. It's kind of pantheism. So why should I, you know, try and repress my sense enjoyments? It's self-defeating. I've got this body. I've got these senses. I should be using them to fully experience the maximum pleasure I can. So this was very different from Buddhism, and it was even a change from the way the Vedic teachings were, which were slightly puritanical. And this was also the time when the Kama Sutra was written, which was basically a kind of almost a sex manual. And this concept of this kind of sense enjoyment and the earth and we are one, it's a bit like the 60s, I think, in the modern Western world, 60s and 70s, 1960s and 70s. But instead of only lasting 20 years, this lasted for about 500 in India, and it was called Bhukti. So, and at the same time, this was when Buddhism reached Tibet, and that was when Tibetan Buddhism started, between the 6th and 12th century, and Tibetan Buddhism was strongly influenced by Tantra. So the Buddhists that went up into Tibet also were very familiar with these Hindu tantric teachings that were going on, and incorporated into the Buddhism that they taught the Tibetans, which is called Mahayana Buddhism. It's the greater path of Buddhism, as opposed to the Theravadan Buddhism that went to Southeast Asia, which is not Tantric Buddhism. Very different forms of Buddhism. Now, after the 12th century, the Muslims invaded India, and Hinduism was again very transformed again by the influence of Islam. And basically the Muslims were Puritans, and they were under the sort of kind of Jewish Christian influence as well, and they believed sex needed to be repressed, couldn't have open sexuality at all. That was against Allah. So they destroyed all these erotic temples, all these erotic statues, wherever they came, and they were, very aggressive, violent meat eaters, and with their aggressive strength, they took control. So they didn't actually convert most of the people. They converted quite a lot into Islam, but the vast majority of Indians remained Hindus. But in order to survive, their Hinduism had to change, and that's when Hinduism stopped being sexually liberated and free. Although it did last up until about the 15th century, they were still having their erotic temples and so forth up around the last Hindu empire, which was up around Hampi in southern India. I think it's called the Vijaya Empire. But after that empire collapsed and was taken over by the Muslims were in control of every state in India, and at that stage, that was the end of. It wasn't the end of Hinduism, but it was the end of the sexually liberated Hinduism. The Muslims put an end to it by the 15th century, and then Hinduism started to become very puritanical, like Islam, and then British came in the 18th century and controlled the country by the 19th century, and they brought in the kind of sexual Puritanism of Christianity. So the combination of those two things have ended up with modern Hinduism, which is actually very puritanical and very sexually repressed and sexually represses women. So that's a quick history lesson in Indian religious history, and a little bit of an explanation of how Tantra developed in India. But effectively by the end of the 15th century, that kind of Tantra was finished in India, and then it became secret. Tantra became a secret teaching within Hinduism, because if it was taught openly, it was the Muslims just killed the people. And so it became a kind of secret hidden art within Hinduism, within the yoga. It was refound, this secret art of Tantra, certainly the sexual side of it, was found by a European called Pierre Bonnard in the 19th century, late 19th century. He found textbooks on like the Kama Sutra and so forth. And he brought the concept of tantric sex to Europe, which we, now sort of understand of what Tantra is. But it's a very superficial, small part of what Tantra really is, tantric sex. But, there is a significant part of Tantra that does relate to sexual freedom and in its base, and that's how the concept of tantric sex comes to us. But then it got taken over by Western kind of view of how we look at sex and the promiscuity, of the sexual revolution in the 1960s. And then it just became a kind of jargon word for, do a bit of yoga and follow a few little rituals and call it tantric sex, and make a lot of money out of it. So that's how tantric sex came as a concept into our society.